Good evening, everyone. My name is Benedict Lecca, Executive Director of the Redwood Library in Newport, Rhode Island. I am presenting tonight's presentation upstairs from the Carpenter Room, and it's a very special one. A dear friend that I've known for years, Jim Chevallier, who is a food historian, but he's just an amazing guy. We met on the 18th century listserv, where all the top people, me not being one of them, but all the 18th century scholars gather on this 18th century listserv. And this is where Jim Chevallier has been recognized as one of the best in the world by the best in the world. I mean, it's amazing. When you are a humble student of the 18th century, as I am, this guy comes up with the best stuff, from what is Enlightenment to what's for breakfast in the 18th century. Speaking of which, many of you members might remember the article in the original, the first, etc. magazine of summer 2018, where he talked, Jim Chevallier did, about the breakfast in the 18th century. Tonight, well, let me step back a bit of business. Up top to the right is the compatibility button. If you find that your sound is problematic, go up there, toggle around, and all your problems will be solved. Second, you will be able to ask questions down in the lower right where it says say something nice. And, before I go any further, I should salute the Jarzombeck family. The Marianne, Mark Jarzombeck, and Michelle Drum from Sotheby's down the street, the good people who have sponsored this event, and I want to thank them for doing that. Now, Jim Chevallier is a specialist in food and bread in France. He has he wrote a book in 2009, August Zhang and the French Croissant. Who knew that, in fact, the croissant was not invented by a Frenchman, but by an Austrian named August Zhang. And, you know, Jim Chevallier has been recognized in France countless times. He was also invited to contribute to the monumental Universal Dictionary of Bread of 2010, edited by a man named Jean-Philippe de Tonac. He's also been cited in various French newspapers, The Liberation, Figaro, on bread, August Zhang, the Croissant. Can you imagine? An American teaching the French about bread. My grandmother always lamented the demise of the Republic. This would be proof positive, except that she much appreciated good work. And Jim Chevallier is one of these people. He comes up with stuff that will just blow your mind. So I'll leave it at that. Jim, welcome, and welcome everyone. And we'll get some questions after the talk. Thank you so much, everyone.
And thank you, Benedict, for that kind introduction. Hello, everybody. I am going to talk to you about the history of the baguette. And the first thing we need to agree upon is, what is a baguette? Now, you may be thinking, I know one when I see one, but in fact, there is no official definition of the baguette, no legal definition, not very satisfactory dictionary definitions. We can go back to the 80s, and there was a food critic in Paris called Patricia Wells, and she came up with a very impressionistic but valid definition of the baguette. Next. I am sorry, I'm calling here for a slide. And I don't see my next slide coming up. Hello? Are we still here? I should be seeing another slide at this point. Sorry, folks. I'm not hearing a thing over here. Okay, so this is, which hopefully everybody can still hear me. I'm not hearing any return on my end. Okay, so she talks of the great slender French baguette with its crackling, crisp, golden exterior, its elastic and creamy interior, its flavor of fresh milled wheat, the 2.5-foot loaf weighing just under 8 ounces. Now that's a pretty good impressionistic definition. She doesn't quite tell you that it's got a glazed crust, but she describes the crust. She notably does not mention something you would almost certainly miss were you not to see it on a baguette, and that is the green, the slashes, which are a very integral part of the baguette. Now, the French bakers have a syndicat, kind of professional union, and they have a site called Espace Pain, bread space. And of course, they have a definition of the baguette next, which is the current or classic baguette is made from a mix of wheat flour. Back, please. Can we go back to the last slide? Of kitchen salt, of yeast or leaven, leaven being sourdough. It measures between 55 and 65 centimeters and weighs between 200 and 300 grams. Not a bad definition, but again, they don't mention the slashes at all, which is strange given that they did on the previous definition. And they say nothing about the glazed crust, which you may or may not have noticed. Now, there's also the dicey question of current or classic, because those aren't the same thing. Current is what people are finding now. Classic in any food tends to be what people are most familiar with going back maybe to their grandparents. It's certainly not the original. It's not necessarily the genuine. It's what's most familiar to most people in recent memory. And I say that because they say that a classic baguette was made with yeast or sourdough, leaven. But in fact, since the 30s at least, one of the beefs about the baguette is it's a very nice bread, but it doesn't last. And it doesn't last because classically it is made with yeast. If you don't know anything about baking, it is good to know that for centuries, bread has been made either with yeast, which originally was brewer's yeast. Bakers would literally get it from brewers. Now it's been refined down into the product that you buy in your supermarket. Or sourdough, which originally was just a piece of dough which was left to ferment and then used to ferment the next batch. Now, even sourdough sometimes is made in more refined ways today, but you can still make old dough, which is one type of sourdough. And some people say, oh, well, these are the same thing. It's the same microbe, and these do indeed both use the same microbe. But sourdough also has lactobacilli in it. And lacto means milk. And when milk goes sour, it's because of the lactobacilli. And that's one of the reasons sourdough actually is a little tangier or tartar than yeast leavened bread. Also, it lasts longer. And that, again, is how we know that the baguette typically has been made with yeast. Not always. And certainly today you can get just about every kind of baguette under the sun. But classically, it has been a yeast leavened bread. Okay, let's look at some myths about the baguette. And I'm going to tell you the myths because if you keep reading the subject, you'll probably encounter them. So it's good to know they're myths. One is that the baguette was invented because Napoleon's soldiers needed a bread they could carry with them while they marched. More specifically, it's sometimes said, so they could put down their pants leg. Now, if you're in the least inclined to believe this version, I recommend you buy a cheap baguette and try putting it down your pants leg, much less marching with it. If you are not that committed to the subject. Next, I advise you to look at this image of Napoleonic soldiers, and you see they had pretty tight pants. All of this is without the fact that the baguette is not even mentioned till over a half century after Napoleon. Another myth is more regrettable because some very serious bread historians will tell you this, not to mention some famous French bakers, and that is the idea that the baguette is not French at all. It is a foreign interloper which drove away the one, the only, the true French bread, the boule, the little round ball. Now, hopefully, after you've listened to most of this talk, you'll know why the baguette is indeed a true French bread, not a French interloper, foreign interloper. But as I say, this is a pretty widespread myth. Then there's one you don't see very often, but it's out there, claiming that when people were first building the metro, groups from two different parts of France got into fights, which is completely credible, and they used knives. And so somebody wanted a bread they could just break without using knives. There's a bunch of problems with this version, not least the fact that the long, narrow breads, at least, were mentioned well before the metro was built. But generally, there's no proof of it at all. The last myth is even more dangerous because it has a core of truth to it, and that is that in 1919, a law was passed which prevented bakers from doing what they had done for centuries, which was to work through the night. This was all part of the general movement to impose an 8-hour day. And that law did indeed exist, and it did indeed take effect in 1920, whereupon the myth goes, bakers could no longer produce the boule in the morning, so they tried to come up with a thinner bread they could make faster. First of all, we know the baguette existed before that law, as we'll see. The law itself never really was applied. People found all kinds of ways of working around it. And in fact, today, French bakers still work all night. They just are compensated for it more substantially. So those are the major myths about the baguette. I'm sure there are other ones out there. People love to come up with explanations for things they really know nothing about, especially in food history. So let's look at the whole question of long breads. Now, if you take dough and turn it around in your hand, you will probably end up with a little ball of dough, and that's what people have often done through history, and so they've made ball-shaped breads. But even the Babylonians made long breads, probably not many, but they are mentioned in the texts. And then the Egyptians made spiral breads, three-pronged breads, conical breads. But next, they also made round breads, as you can see from this one hieroglyph there, little circle slightly filled in. And as you can see from the three hieroglyphs at the bottom, they made long bread. The Greeks tended to prefer, from what I've seen in images, low hemispheres, but somebody did find a red clay mold in the shape of a long bread with a split down the middle, which, as it happens, corresponds to one later French bread. So long breads have been made through history, not often and not dominant in any culture. Now we come to the culture which is most important, and that is Rome. Why? Because French bread, as we know it today, descends pretty directly from Roman bread. And again, the Romans made different kinds of bread. I'm sure you've seen the segmented bread from Pompeii called the quadratus, and that bread was made in other parts of the empire. And there are a whole bunch of other shapes too. But next, we know they made round breads because this frieze from a baker's tomb, he called himself a baker, he's probably more of a baking official, in Rome. This is still, by the way, standing perilously in the middle of a roundabout in Rome. And if you look at the lowest panel, you see men carrying round loaves of bread, little spheres of bread, which they're then weighing. And this was probably the municipal bread. When they gave out bread, as you may know they did later, This was probably the bread they made. Now, we know they made this kind of bread in Gaul after they took it over next, because we have images of those breads. That is, the archaeologists have actually found them. And so we have a color image here of one from Reims, and then the three black and whites are from Amiens. And as is always the case with bread when it's preserved, these were burnt. They were caught in fires. Sometimes breads are burnt in accidental fires. Sometimes they're burned in rites, but that's mainly how bread has survived. As far back as the Neolithic period, by the way, which is a whole other question. So you'll note these are pretty small. And in fact, the best breads would be small for quite a while, very much what we would consider rolls. The early Middle Ages, we don't know much about the bread. Texts tend to just talk about bread. We know there were some low hemispherical loaves, but probably the most common loaves were spherical, like these. Now, next, we go to the late Middle Ages, and certainly you must have seen some images like this one of a little spherical bread, which the French call the boule, the ball. And if you look in the background of the slide, and you see that shield for the coat of arms for a baker's group, it also has the three spheres on it. This was the shape of bread for centuries in France. When you made a bigger bread, it would collapse out into a hemisphere, but basically most breads were made as spheres or hemispheres. Next, you would see them sometimes on tables, so they seem to be a little lighter. Note, these are light. They're not nice and brown the way you expect a loaf to be. That is probably because they had grated off the crust, and we will get back to that. We go up to the 16th century image next, and it's still essentially the same bread. Now, again, there were some variants. You see some, especially these little low hemispheres sometimes, but this remained the main form of bread for over a millennium in France. This is a good time to stop and look at what French bread was like for a very long time. First, it was made from light wheat, soft wheat. Hard wheat would not come to France for a very long time. Today, soft wheat is used for pastry, but that's what was used to make bread at the time. It does not leaven very well, and sourdough was the main leavening. So you had a wheat which didn't leaven very well, and a method which wasn't very strong. Salt is a native French product. It had not been expensive, but then French kings began to tax it and became very expensive. So bakers actually used less and sometimes no salt, believe it or not. And crust was not important. As I mentioned, in big households, it was grated off. And when you read descriptions of really good breads, they do not mention the crust. It was also made from what was called hard dough, pâte ferme, which means it was very little hydrated. It didn't have much water in it. When you do that, you don't get very big eyes, as the French call the holes in bread. Now, the better breads, we know that the upscale breads did have big eyes, but generally bread was very hard, and that actually had an advantage, which it would last longer. But for a long time, that's how French bread was made. Now, something else to know about bread, starting pretty much in the 14th century and going forward. In cities, there were three qualities of bread by statute: white, dark white, and dark. Now, they had specific names that would vary from one era to the next, but that was essentially the distinction. The city would set the weight, it would set the price. Sometimes you had some better types of bread, which were more loosely defined, but you always had these statutory breads or regulatory breads that were defined by the municipality. And this was by city, by the way. So the names would also vary by region or city. We get to the 17th century, and this is still the case. You still have statutory breads. For most of the 17th century going into the 18th, Parisian bakers were now divided into makers of gros pain and petit pain, that is large or coarse bread, and little breads, which today would mean rolls, petit pain. Next, so here we have an image of a bread seller. He's probably not the actual baker selling gros pain, which to my mind looks pretty appetizing, I must say. But inside it was probably very dense and kind of rough, but I still wouldn't mind tasting one. And then the first bread statute, because every century you had a few bread statutes for the cities. And in Paris, the first bread statute next was in 1635, and it was explicitly for the bakers of little breads. Now, this lists the 3 grades of bread. One thing that's strange here is the coarser, the darker breads here were still under a pound, which had typically been true of the whitest bread, but not the others. Here they really were little breads at this point. But the statute also gives them the right to make pain moelleux, which very literally means softish bread. Pain moelleux is a term, at least. It goes back to the 14th century. It seems to have been used for a while as an equivalent to pain de bouche, which was a very aristocratic bread. It was a finer bread and probably did indeed have larger holes in the dough, in the crumb, but it would certainly have been made with sourdough for a long time. Here they're allowed to make pain moelleux in the style of Gonesse. Gonesse was a city outside Paris known for its bread. The bread was supposedly only made in Gonesse because of the water, but here the French bakers, the Parisian bakers, are making it in Gonesse style. Now, sometime before the next statute, 10 years later, Parisian bakers began to make special breads using some milk or butter, which had been used in the past, but not often, and leavening it with yeast. And so we get to the next statute next. And the city is now complaining. It still lists prices for the various statutory breads, and now the cruder breads are heavier once again. But it also says that bakers have been ignoring the law and allowing themselves to substitute several other sorts of breads, to which they give names according to their fantasies. Now, note that word fantasies, because very soon after this, we get a whole category of bread called pain de fantaisie. In English, it would become known as fancy bread. And the most distinguishing aspect of a pain de fantaisie was it was not made according to the statutory regulations. And that would be true for several centuries. What bakers liked about it was you had no set price or weight for a pain de fantaisie. So, of course, the bakers loved that, especially since the people who bought the bread quite often didn't care because they were well off. And the statute lists some of the names they gave. Pain de la Reine, Queen-style bread. Now, one explanation for this change is that supposedly Marie de Medici introduced the idea of using yeast in French bread. That idea only comes up much later, and I'm not sure how dependable it is, but the fact they named it Pain de la Reine is suggestive. À la Monteron. Monteron was a famous financier, so it's like calling it Warren Buffett bread. À la mode, fashionable bread. Pain blême, which is pale bread. And again, façon de Gonesse, Gonesse-style bread. And there's a bunch of other names. Some of these were probably made in different shapes, too. There are now mentions of other shapes. So this is the beginning of variety in French bakeries, which is something we're used to today, but which hadn't existed really at all before that. And the statute goes on the next page to complain that many bakers are not producing enough statutory bread at all, which is, they say, the bread of the little people. And so they order the bakers to be sure to have enough statutory bread by 10 o'clock in their shops. And if they don't, they then have to sell the fancy bread for the price, for the regulated price, which of course they didn't want to do. Over time, the term pain mollet became applied to these new yeast leavened breads. So going forward, when you see the term pain mollet, it applies to a small yeast leavened bread. Okay, so for a few decades, those who could afford pain mollet and liked it bought it. Other people were still supposed to have statutory regulated bread. And everything was going just fine until 1667, when the fate of yeast leavened bread hung in the balance. Not because of the bakers, because of the taverns, inns, and cabarets, who at the time were the meal providers. They were essentially the restaurants of their times, and sometimes, by the way, served some very good meals, despite what you'll hear elsewhere. But they were obliged by statute to buy their bread from the bakers of petit pain, and they wanted to buy their bread from the bakers of gros pain. More generally, they wanted to buy it from the bakers outside Paris, the so-called forains, no doubt because it was cheaper, and then they would have cut up these larger breads and served those to their clients. Apparently, a lot of petit pain at this point was made with yeast, and so some clever soul, probably a lawyer, came up with the idea that yeast was dangerous and actually got the medical faculty to issue a ruling that yeast was poison, shouldn't go into the human body. Never mind that people had been eating yeast leavened bread for decades at this point. Naturally, there was pushback, and it ended up before the Parlement, which was really a supreme court under the old regime. And the outcome, it's a fun thing to read about, but it's long, was ultimately, yes, the Parisian bakers could use yeast, but they had to buy their yeast from the Parisian brewers. And yeast bread was saved, to the great relief of future bread eaters of French bread. And that was the official consecration of using yeast in bread. Now, people still didn't generally make bread with yeast, only the better, more expensive bread. Sometimes they would add some yeast in with a sourdough to kind of pump it up a little bit because it ferments faster. So we get to the end of the 17th century, and bread in general had become softer, probably under the influence of these pain mollets. And so instead of using pâte ferme, hard dough, they didn't use soft dough, pâte molle. They used something which was neither one nor the other, and so it was called pâte bâtarde, bastard dough. And most French bread today is still essentially made with this dough. When you do that, you begin to get a much softer crumb, the crumb being the inside of the bread. And you no longer have this real purchase you get when you bite into a hard crumb. So by one account in the 18th century, Parisian bakers began to bring the sides of the bread closer together because then the crust becomes more important. And here is where crust, which had not been important at all in previous centuries, becomes very important in bread. And when you bring the sides together, you begin to get narrow loaves. We don't know exactly when this happened, but when you go into the middle of the 18th century and bread writers talk about making the small round loaf, now they say, this is how we used to make bread. Next slide. But now it is a long, narrow shape which has triumphed. And here we have an 18th century image of a woman carrying a long, narrow bread. So it's very clear that the long, narrow shape grew up in France and that it was firmly established by the 18th century. Now, another writer on bread complained that some bread had become so long and narrow, it was like a flute. And note that word because he's using it as a comparison now, but it would be a noun later. And that some bread was so narrow that it was only crust. And the man making this complaint is better known for having introduced the potato to France. Parmentier, who got involved with the potato because he was trying to make cheaper bread for times of famine. He didn't really get very far with that, but he did make the potato very popular. Next, so here we have a bakehouse, and you can see they're making these little sort of baguette-like breads and stacking them up. Next, here we have a page from a baker's manual, and you see these breads in the middle. They're sort of baguette-like with the benton, the baskets used to make them. And you have some tourtes, which are the round breads on the bottom, and then some other breads over the top. Next. Now we have another plate, and you see the bread in the middle looks almost exactly like a baguette, except it's a little fatter, and it has no slashes, no grigne. Note the funny little small breads above it. Those are all pain de fantaisie, and they had different names and take different shapes. One, the closest to the baguette-like bread, actually looked like an artichoke, and it was called pain artichaut, and it was remarkably persistent. It was still being made at the start of the 19th century. Why people liked a bread that looked like an artichoke, I don't know, but they're not hard to make should you be tempted to do it. Also, note the bread at the very top with the big groove down the middle. We will get back to that later. Next. And so here we have a bake shop. As you can see, it's got bars in the windows because during famines, people would actually attack the bakeries. It's got wooden shelves. It's a pretty rustic looking place. And this man has got a hoot on his back, a kind of straw knapsack for people who carried various things. And these certainly look like baguettes from the side. They're certainly long, narrow breads. Now, this man is probably what's called a porteur de pain, a bread porter. But most bread porters, starting in the 18th century, were women. They were called porteuses de pain. And we will see more about them. Okay, so we get to the revolution, which was largely prompted by a shortage of bread, but the revolutionaries really didn't do much about bread, probably because they liked eating good bread themselves, and a lot of the revolutionaries lived very well for a while. But ultimately, things got really desperate, and so they made everybody in France eat some form of a least common denominator of bread, which was made with wheat, but also some barley, some bran. It was a pretty terrible bread, and it was called pain d'égalité, equality bread, and it was certainly equal in one sense, which is that it was hated equally across France. We get to the start of the 19th century, and Napoleon first is part of a triumvirate and then just takes over completely, and he made luxury acceptable again. Now, the first great food critic appeared at this time, Guillemot de la Reynière, and he complained about how French bread had gone downhill under the Revolution. And then in 1806, he praised the flute at a certain baker's, and now he's talking about a long, narrow bread, probably like the shorter, long, narrow breads we saw in the earlier images. But that term became a very general one for just any long, narrow bread, even when the bread itself had a particular name. And so you see references to flute all through the 19th century. There was a flute à soupe, which was a very specific, small, crusty, narrow bread, which was used to dip into soup. So some foreigners thought that French bread was just fine and it was still the best in Europe. Some people thought it had seriously gone downhill. And one of these supposedly was an Austrian artillery officer named August Zhang. Next. Now the story goes, and I'm really not sure, don't have any firsthand version of the story, but supposedly he came to Paris and didn't like the bread and decided what the French really needed was good Viennese bread. And Viennese bread really was very well regarded at the time. They were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so they had ready access to Hungarian flour, which was the best in Europe. They had specific techniques that worked very well. And they were a beer drinking country, and the Germanic countries and the beer drinking countries in general tended to leaven their bread with yeast. So these were some of the things that made their bread better, and not the only ones. Anyway, in the late 30s, he and a partner bought a bakery on the Rue de Richelieu, which today is a rather dreary street that goes by the Palais Royal, but back then it may have been the most exciting street in Paris, with fancy cafes and music publishers and dressmakers and fancily dressed women wandering the streets looking for their own sort of client. It was a very lively place, and it was a good place to open the first Viennese bakery, Boulangerie Viennoise. But he didn't do very well. The French showed no interest in the Kaiser Semmel, which was the best Austrian roll. It was made with a little milk in the dough, Hungarian flour, yeast. We don't think that much of it today because we call it the Kaiser roll, but back then it was very well viewed. And then made from the same dough, you had a crescent-shaped roll called the Kipfel. And the Austrians loved these, but the French weren't convinced. Luckily, Zhang was in the same building as next La Presse, which was the first French penny press. That is, you didn't buy it by subscription, you simply paid a cheap price for it, as we typically do today, and it was supported by advertising. And this innovation, as it was in France, made Émile de Girardin, the publisher, very rich, a fact not lost on Zhang, who would later become a press magnate. But at this point, he mainly took the hint that advertising was important. And in November of 1839, a very flattering mention appeared in La Presse about the Boulangerie Viennoise. By 1840, it was very popular. And the French bakers were imitating a number of its bread, notably the crescent-shaped Kipfel, which, since it was shaped like a crescent, they just called it crescent, which in French is croissant. And within about 10 years of French, we're just talking about our croissant. Short memories in that regard, although there were all kinds of myths about Austrians that would appear later in regard to the croissant. Now, the other popular Austrian bread, Zhang made his breads with a mold. He used mechanical means, and in fact, one of his ads boasted untouched by human hands, a little in advance of his time in that regard. So he took probably the dough for the Kaiser Semmel, but he made it in a mold, so it was a rectangular bread. And then the French bakers, when they imitated him, made it by hand, and they made these little rolls in various shapes. They were never very long, they were never very big. But pain viennois became the hallmark of luxury. If you were well off, you ate pain viennois. And one man, in talking about his decline of fortunes, said he could no longer eat pain viennois. Poor him. Now, next, in the 20th century, this is what a pain viennois looked like. It was a very long, narrow bread with lots of slashes in it, shinier than a baguette, but otherwise very baguette-like. And my own guess, and I can only say it's a guess, is that in the 20th century, French bakers seeing this and knowing Zhang introduced the pain viennois, decided, oh, he introduced the baguette. The baguette's Austrian. Which, of course, it isn't, because we've seen the French long before this had long, narrow breads. But I suspect that is where this myth comes from. People in the time certainly don't talk about Zhang introducing any long, narrow bread. What they do talk about is a Viennese method where, after bakers swabbed out the ovens, which you had to do because they used to burn the fuel right in the oven, they would let the moisture sit, and then in the next batch, a steam would form, and it would fall on dextrine, which is a sugar that forms on the surface of baking bread, and melt it, and you would get a glaze, like the glaze you see on today's baguette. And if you look at Julia Child's recipe for a baguette, she tells you to create steam in the oven, which descends directly from August Zhang, or from the Viennese bakers. French bakers liked this so much that French inventors began to invent what they called the Viennese oven. The Viennese didn't. And they came in all kinds of models. Next, this is one example of one. As you can see, it has a very solid door on it with an arm to hold it in. And typically the sole, the floor, was also slanted to help the steam go down. And most French bread today is made in a steam oven. That became very standard. And that is one thing Zhang indeed did introduce. Also, Zhang's bakery was nothing like the rustic style French bakeries, such as the 18th century bakery we just saw. His bakery, next, had Austro-Hungarian elegance with mirrors and brass fittings and decorations on the ceilings. It was a really very elegant place. Now, as some French bakers opened boulangeries viennoises, and they actually called them Viennese bakeries, although they were running them, because there was a big fad for Viennese bakers for quite a while, they would imitate this decor. And so next, you began to get bakeries in Paris, which were as fancy as Zhang's. And today, you can still see really lovely spaces that were bakeries. Often they've become dress shops or something of the sort. There's a few bakeries that keep this decor, but they become very rare. And that, too, can be traced right back to Auguste Zhang. You can see where I wrote a book on this guy. Another effect of Zhang was to lead to two types of bread being sold in French bakeries. One was pain français, which was made with sourdough, and then the other was pain viennois, Viennese bread, which was now not just the Viennese loaf, but all kinds of breads made with yeast and good Hungarian flour when they could afford it. It was an import, so it was very expensive. But so he left a lot of marks on Parisian baking. And in fact, an American would write later, the real French bread today is more of an Austrian than a French product, which is pushing a point a bit, but he did leave a lot of marks on it. Now, somewhere towards the start of the 19th century, we don't know exactly when, next, you began to see a lot of these sort of wide breads with a split, a font down the middle. They were split, they were fondue, and they were called fondue. Not like the dish, but F-E-N-D-U. The breads in back of them were probably also considered fondue, but the more typical shape was the one he's holding in front of him. You can tell he's a baker because he has his shirt off. These were kind of the baguette of the 19th century. You see images of housewives and maids going home and carrying a fondue the way they would later carry a baguette. So they're very influential, and you see them all the way up until the start of the 20th century. When there was a big flood in 1910, you have pictures of bakers handing fondue over to housewives from boats. But something else happened, and this was probably around 1835, a little before Zhang got going, which is that Parisian bakers, for unknown reasons, began to make really long breads. And one American tourist described them as being like crowbars, and that was not exaggerated. Some were 2 meters long. Why? Well, one possible reason is that a pain de fantaisie was now anything over 70 centimeters, which means that the baker, once again, did not have to give you the exact weight or charge a set price. But a lot of these same breads could be made in 3 feet long or shorter sizes. So it's really not clear why this happened, but I can tell you that all the way past World War II, you could still see gigantic loaves in Paris, which most Parisians don't know themselves. And some were like this bread, but much longer and sometimes with a deeper space down the middle. And they were for wine shops, which sold meals. And this was a bread for the wine shop customers. And they were called pain marchand de vin, wine shop loaves. Some were very much like those skinnier breads, but the green, the slit was on the side, and they were called grignons. And then you had a bread that looked almost exactly like a baguette. In fact, when it was made 3 feet long, which it could be, it looked exactly like a baguette. but often it was made very long. Next. And now we have a young American tourist discovering French bread for the first time, a little bemused. And this is not the longest Jocko, because it seems to be a Jocko, but it's certainly longer than any bread this poor young man was used to. And these were very popular in Paris. Now, next, we have this plate of various 19th century French breads. You can see by now there were quite a variety of them. The cut one at the front with the lozenge shape, that rhythmic pattern was known as a polka. So any bread with that bread was called a polka bread. You have a ring-shaped bread now called a crown. Typically, this kind of bread would be segmented, so you could break it up. You have several splits. And then all the way over to the left, you see a bread that sure looks like a baguette, or maybe a 3-foot-long Jocko. But no, it is a white pain de fantaisie. And now the term fantaisie is being used for a specific loaf. Now, it still was a category, would remain a category for decades. But every once in a while, you see a reference to a loaf called the pain de fantaisie. Was this really a 3-foot-long Jocko? That's my own theory, but I got nothing to back it up. So I can just tell you that that seems the most likely explanation. Otherwise, you end up with two breads that look like a baguette plus the later baguette. Confusing, eh? Now, if you're thinking for those really long breads that it must have been hard to get them home without breaking them. Well, first of all, one writer did say that they tended to break, but also people didn't typically just pick them up and carry them home. Next, they had professionals to do that, and these were the poor porteuses de pain. And as you can see, some carried the bread in their aprons. The child was not an actual porteuse de pain. This was a chocolate ad. And then some carried them on a hutte. And as you can see, this poor woman is carrying really long and no doubt very heavy breads. There is a whole work to be written on the porteuses de pain. Their lives were so hard that one man wrote a melodramatic novel which was so popular that it was still being made as a TV film in the 70s, long after the porteuses de pain themselves had disappeared. Next, and then some of them had wagons, and this woman is using both her apron and a wagon, and her kind of worn look is probably more typical of how a lot of them looked after very hard lives. Some of them just didn't last in the profession. It was a really tough profession. And these wagons sometimes were drawn by horses or even, next, dogs. As we see here with a different type of wagon, which even has two people in it. And you can see there are fondue in the window and in the wagon, and that poor little puppy has to tug these people and the breads. Now, somebody claims that the fondue was invented to look just like a grain of wheat. And in fact, these fondue do look like grains of wheat. I have my doubts about that explanation, but for whatever reason, it is true that some fondue look very much like grains of wheat, if you've ever looked at a grain of wheat up close, which is worth doing because they're rather beautiful. Next. So now we have another porteuse de pain. And what is most interesting in this image, because it's from 1897, very close to the 20th century, are the long, narrow, really narrow, stick-like breads in the crook of her arm. And they look very much like a stick. One word for a stick in French is baguette. There's also bâton and others, but baguette is a common word for a stick. Now, next, in 1902, there was an Austrian baker named Emil Braun who put out a work on European breads, and he shows what he calls a French stick. Unfortunately, he does not actually give us the name of the French name, but again, baguette was one word for stick, and I'm pretty sure this is an early baguette. There was also a a baker who put out a manual around the same time where he lists 3 different kinds of baguettes. One was 35 gram. That was probably a Croissant, a breadstick, which had been called a baguette in the past, because we call it a stick as well, do we not? But then one was 100 grams and one was 200 and some grams, and those would have been this kind of baguette. So there's pretty good evidence the baguette was already around at the start of the 20th century. Now, next, we have these images, which are from around the same time, and they certainly have several breads that look like they could be baguettes. No, the group at right, the leftmost bread certainly likes a baguette, but that is a pain jacot. That's a jacot. Not one of these breads, of these many breads, even the skinny one at left, not one of them is called a baguette. And that's an ongoing problem in researching baguettes, is that even when we know they're around, we see very little references to them early on. Next, here we have an image of a bakery of the time, and you see these little narrow breads on the right side of the bakery. They were probably baguettes. They might have just been called flute at this point. Now, there was a kind of periodical / encyclopedia which published in 1913, next, and they show an image of breads which are said to be the most common breads in Parisian baking. Now, you might be thinking that second bread in is a baguette, because it certainly looks like a modern baguette. But once again, it's a jacot. It is the very skinny bread all the way to the left, which is a baguette. So it's very clear that the early baguette really did look like a stick. It wasn't just stick-like today's baguette. It was really, really skinny. Why did Parisian bakers, after making long, narrow breads for over a century, suddenly start making a bread that was really, really skinny and really like a stick? Not a clue. No idea. This is just one of these things that happens, and it's very tempting to come up with an explanation for it. And I might someday, because I've found lots of information I never thought to find, but it's really not clear why that happened. Note, by the way, the 3 breads at right, which are all polkas, even though they're all in different shapes. So World War I comes along. The Parisians have to eat dark bread, which they hated. They didn't care there was a war on. They wanted white bread. Then long, narrow breads were banned, mainly because they were not a good use of wheat. And yet, in 1917, a journalist from the New York Times managed to get, next, what he called baguettes, or sticks, as the long French rolls are called. Now, note that the English, for a long time, called good breads rolls, no matter what size they were. So that's why he's using that sort of. I suppose Americans were doing it too. I've seen it mainly in English usage. This is very likely the first full-on recipe for the baguette, certainly in English, and possibly in French, since that baker's manual I mentioned doesn't really give you specific directions for the baguette per se. Let me just shut off my phone here. Oh, I'm hanging up. Here we are.
Hello. Please leave a message after the tone.
Luckily, the spammer didn't choose to leave a message, as they often do. Okay, so the note that they don't tell you how much flour to use here, because in French baking recipes, often they just expect you to know how much you need to make a consistent dough. They say to use yeast. Now, that earlier set of instructions I talked about mentions a baguette both in a group of Parisian breads, French breads, which would have been made with sourdough, but also among the Vienna breads, which would have been made with yeast. So the very first baguettes were probably made with both yeast and sourdough, despite this instruction. Note, too, that this American journalist seems to think that readers in New York, at least, will have some idea of what a baguette is and some interest in making one. So clearly the baguette was known even to some English speakers at this point. But again, it's barely mentioned. Now, we get to 1920, the war is over, and the French still have to eat dark bread. Until July 1920, next, when an item in the Figaro says exuberantly, in a few days, we will see again, finally on our tables, the good white bread made of good wheat flour, and which we have awaited for so long. And the relief is almost palpable. The poor Parisians really miss their white bread. Next, and we have this cover from that period, and from that very month, actually, and you see this little old lady carrying what look like baguettes for the period. Over to the right, you see a fondue, and then a note saying flute. I don't know if it goes on to say flute à soup, because probably these were the little all crusty flutes that were used to put in soup. Now, strangely enough, she's not asking for any of these. She wants a polka, and she says, they've authorized dancing bowls again. Why can't you make a polka? This is French bread humor. So a month later, a statute came out defining the prices and weights of 4 breads. Now, most of these have not remained well known at all. It's kind of curious as to why they were named here. But next, the 4th one is the very first mention we have of the baguette, having a minimum weight of 80 grams and a maximum length of 40 centimeters. I mean, the first legal mention. This is like the official legal birth of the baguette after what appears to be 2 decades of its existing. Why did it take so long? I truly can't tell you. Now, if we look at the next image, and we see a bakery from about that time, and again, we see these little narrow baguettes. In 1922, there was another statute which listed 2 types of baguette. One was 100 grams, so it would have been much like the ones we see in this shop window. But another was 300, so that would have been a more substantial baguette. Next, we have this plate from the Larousse in 1922, and it has what looks like it should be a baguette, number 2. But again, it's a pain de fantaisie, or rich bread, which means it probably had some milk in it. And here we are over 2 decades after the baguette first appeared, and it's still not mentioned in a French encyclopedia. Just very curious. Can't tell you why. So we can go on to the next image. This image is from a later work, but is probably an earlier image. Unfortunately, it's undated, but judging by the types of breads in it, it was probably from before World War I. And you see a bunch of breads which could be baguettes. All the way to the left, you see 2 very baguette-like breads, but they are noted as pain roulé, rolled breads. And when you made a bread long, you rolled it to make it long, so they were called pain roulé. And then you look in the group at right, and you see another long, narrow bread, which is also called a pain roulé, but it's a pain roulé dit baguette, called baguette. So that is a baguette, as is the one all the way to the right, which is a 100-gram baguette. The first baguette is a 300-gram. So it seems like the long, narrow shape lasted for some time. We can go to the next slide. And we get to 1938 and the first Larousse gastronomique, which was translated in 1960. But it also has this plate. Very regrettably, they have not done this for subsequent editions. That is, they haven't shown us all the different breads that were common at a given moment. It's a very useful exercise, and I wish they would take it up again. So here we have the bread at the top, which is a pain marchand de vin. You can see it's pretty long, the wine shop loaf. then an English baguette, whatever an English baguette may be, and then a baguette de Grau. Grau is a finer flour. This almost looks like that pain de noix we saw before. The bread beneath those two is not a baguette, it's a jacco, as is the very long bread beneath it. What is the long, skinny bread going across the three breads? That is now a baguette ficelle. Ficelle means twine, and breads that looked like the original baguette were now called twines, ficelle. And they were very popular in France for a very long time. They've become harder to find, but that bread is a survival of the very first baguette. Now, I'll just rush through some other history. During World War II, long breads were banned again, including baguettes. And then after the war, you begin to get complaints about the baguette, that they're being made carelessly, that they're not good, that they've lost their quality. And this goes on through the 60s into the 70s, and there became a whole movement to improve French bread, which ultimately resulted in a law which did not define the baguette, but defined pain de tradition, a certain type of high quality bread. And also a law was passed that meant you couldn't call a bread pain maison, house bread, if you hadn't made it from scratch, because bakers were getting industrial dough and just baking it and calling it pain maison, which continued for a while for croissant. I think that has been banned for croissant as well. But that was one reason the quality had gone down. In the intervening years, you've gotten artisan bread makers who make magnificent baguettes, which receive prices, but you also have supermarkets selling baguettes. You have dispensers selling baguettes. Basically, you have two contrary movements: great improvement in baguettes, and then horrifying, to put it simply, tendencies. And people, the most horrifying thing is the French are buying them. Clearly, the French are perfectly happy to buy their bread in the supermarket, since supermarkets keeps selling them. So next, we come to my image from 2013. The top bread is a baguette. The middle bread is a batarde, not a very thick batarde. And the lower one is a ficelle, which was really hard to find in 2013. Note that the batarde, the bastard, is so called because it was longer than a short bread, but shorter than a baguette. So again, neither one nor the other. Next, the typical batarde tends to look a little bit more like this, but really there's no exact standard for the batarde anymore. When you buy batarde in America, because a lot of American companies make them now, they tend to take on all kinds of different shapes. So that brings us to modern times and ends the history of the baguette. I thank you for your attention. So I presume some people have questions, I hope. Oh, I see. Thank you for my presentation. I thank you for that. Any questions? Or do you just want to go and buy a baguette and try putting it down your pants leg?
Jim, thank you so much. That was very informative. I guess I just have a very quick question about, well, me, myself, I like the crust. So one could speculate, often I get a ficelle for the very reason that it is thinner and thus crustier all around. I like the crust. I don't like the filling, oddly enough. Yeah. So I'm just presuming, you know, in me personally, I get the ficelle because it's crunchier, more crust, less in innards. But you know, that's just me.
Yeah, and some standard baguettes have a nicer crust than others as far as that goes. But yeah, no, I like good crust as well. And you know, when I was a little American kid eating really terrible bread, when my mother would buy French bread, she'd say, "This is better for your teeth because it gives them more of a workout." So I always thought a baguette was healthier, which is probably not true. That's what I was told.
Or I also tend to get them well done, bien cuit, you know, just so that it's Anyways, and we have Bonsoir from the Bec Sucré, which is a relatively new bakery here in Newport that is highly regarded. Everyone is there. So Belinda, my evening salutations to you. Are there any questions? Let's see. There's 8 questions. Why do baguettes taste better in France than anywhere else?
I'm not absolutely sure that's true, but it's true. It's true that the flour is different. There are things that are much harder to do here. And of course, there's a tradition of making them. But we have some very good. Where I've had some of the best French bread in LA is in Korean bakeries. When Koreans make French bread, they make them very, very well. By the way, you may or may not be horrified to know that you can, if you're the right kind of person in North Korea, you can get a baguette. Of course, that's not what most North Koreans are eating, but they are making baguettes in North Korea, which is kind of the Marie Antoinette version of the baguette as far as I'm concerned.
Here is a question. Did the French have an equivalent to the British Manchet?
That's actually a French term, Manchet. They did. I think it was just the pain, not a pain bourgeois, basically. It's just the household bread. But I have to say, I don't remember the exact parameters of the English manchet. But yeah, it was sort of the common white loaf. The French have always tended to use sourdough, and the English always tended to use yeast. But I think the manchet actually was made with sourdough.
Someone is asking, what is the difference between Hungarian flour and French flour at that time?
I'm not enough of an expert on wheat to see why. I imagine the Hungarian flour was harder, but it's kind of like asking what's the difference between one good Burgundy and another. You would have to be an expert taster to say why, because the nuances between wheat, even within France, there's a wonderful work from the 16th century, which goes into all the different wheats from regions in France. And really, you feel like you're reading about grapes and wines, because he makes distinctions between these grains, which are very fine-tuned. And, the differences between them are probably on that level. And I always say, I write about bread because I don't make it, and I don't particularly taste it all that well, unlike Stephen Kaplan, who actually has a whole grading system for bread. So
we'll take two questions. Someone wants to know, my son-in-law is French and lives in France. Is there a way to send this presentation to Frédéric? So we'll
yes, the answer is yes.
Yes, it'll be, in fact, it's recorded. It will be on the Redwood Library YouTube channel. So you might
go where?
On the Redwood Library YouTube channel. Go to the website, and we'll go from there. Let's see, how many slashes, someone is asking. The slashes at the top.
I think on a baguette, they tend to be 5. I'm not sure it's codified, but let me see. Well, actually, I look at my baguette, and I only see 3. But then I have a baguette I bought in the States, 1, 2, 3, and it has 5. Yeah, I suppose it also depends how wide you make the slashes. But not all baguettes are exactly the same length either, and that's going to change the number of slashes. By the way, I didn't touch on the point that slashes really don't appear at all until the very end of the 18th century. And one explanation is that as bakers began to use more yeast, when you make a yeast leavened bread, if you don't leave an outlet for the gas, it'll actually pop out somewhere else. And then once people got used to doing that, I guess they did it on all the breads. There's, strangely enough, a Gallo-Roman bread that was found from, I don't know, 100 AD or so, that actually has 3 slashes on it, which is really striking. But otherwise, it's unheard of before the 19th century.
Okay.
If I may, I will comment.
Yes.
This is this book. before the baguette, which looks like it's reversed on the screen, but trust me, it says before the baguette. And if you want to know all the stuff in French bread, because there's a lot to French bread before the baguette, believe it or not, there are a lot of French breads before the baguette. That book gives you that history. So.
Excellent. And I should mention that Jim Chevallier has a website. You can track him down. If you Google baguette and get on Wikipedia, he is footnote number 4. And from there you get to his website. Anyways, I want to thank you, Jim, very much for this very fascinating presentation. I also want to alert everyone. First of all, if you're not a member of the Redwood, go ahead and make the leap. If you do get on the YouTube channel, go ahead and subscribe. That would be very helpful to us. I'd much appreciate it. Next Wednesday will be Dr. Edward Marquardt continuing his 12-part series where he leads us through various periods of 19th century music. And then next Thursday, a week from tonight, will be Dr. John Rice, who will detail the history of his own family and the arrival of Frederick Douglass in Newport in the 1850s or 60s. I can't remember exactly when, but that will be a very good talk as well. And that is being put together in collaboration with Stages of Freedom. So with that, I will leave it to you all to join us next week. I want to thank Jim Chevallier again and all of the viewers tonight. Thank you very much and have a great evening. Thank you.